All right, so let's imagine something for a second. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and poof, income tax is gone. Just like that. I mean, no more of that big chunk disappearing from your paycheck each month. Pretty nice thought, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be happy about that.
Oh, it's not just a fantasy. This was a real proposal from former President Trump, no less. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore this idea. Replacing income tax, which, by the way, makes up almost half of what the government brings in. We're going to replace that with tariffs. Tariffs on goods we import from other countries.
It's a pretty radical idea.
It is. And we're going to look at what it could mean for you, for businesses, and even for countries all over the world.
There's definitely a lot to unpack there.
For sure. So just to lay it all out, no more income tax, and instead the government gets its money from tariffs, basically taxes on stuff coming in from other countries. So help me out here. What does that actually look like for the average person? Like, what about my grocery bill?
Well, you know how much everyone loves avocados these days.
Guilty as charged.
Well, if they're coming from Mexico, like a lot of them do, get ready for a price jump.
Like, how much are we talking?
I've seen estimates saying maybe even 20% more.
Ouch.
And it's not just avocados.
Oof, yeah.
It's that new phone you might want, or that fancy imported car.
Oof, yeah.
Pretty much anything you buy that's made overseas could end up costing a lot more.
So basically, all that money I'm saving by not paying income tax, I'm just going to end up spending it on more expensive stuff anyway.
That's one way to look at it.
And what about businesses? They've got to be freaking out about this, right?
For sure. Think about a small business, like a bakery.
What?
They use imported vanilla extract for their cakes.
Sure.
Now suddenly that vanilla costs twice as much.
Yikes.
What are they supposed to do?
Yeah, that's a tough spot.
Do they raise prices and risk losing customers?
Right.
Or do they eat that extra cost and lose profits?
Not good options. Okay, so I'm already seeing how this is a lot more complicated than just saying, yay, no more income tax. But let's step back for a second. Can tariffs really bring in enough money to replace all that lost income tax revenue? That just seems like such a long shot.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical about that. Even economists are divided on whether it would work.
So some of them are saying it's just not possible.
Exactly. We're not talking about some small side project here. Income tax is like the main source of funding for the government.
So if they're getting rid of that, they better be pretty sure they can replace it.
Yeah, they'd need to come up with some really creative new ways to bring in money.
Or make some serious cuts.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's say they figure out the money part somehow. What about the rest of the world? I mean, we don't live in a vacuum. Suddenly slapping tariffs on everything seems like it would ruffle some feathers.
You're not wrong.
Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, imagine the U.S. suddenly raising tariffs on goods from China,
Oh,
Canada,
oh boy.
the EU, some of our biggest trading partners.
They're not just going to take that lying down, are they?
Nope. You can bet they'll retaliate.
With their own tariffs.
It's most likely.
So basically a trade war.
Pretty much.
Tariffs flying back and forth.
Yeah, it could get messy.
Messy seems like an understatement.
It could disrupt global supply chains that businesses all over the world depend on.
Ugh, that's not good.
Companies would have to completely rethink how they do things.
And it would probably hurt countries that rely on trade with the U.S.
Yeah, definitely a possibility.
So this idea that started out as just swapping income tax for tariffs, it's starting to feel like it could set off a global economic earthquake.
It's definitely not a simple solution.
But, okay, before we get too doom and gloom,
yeah,
there has to be another side to this coin, right?
Oh, definitely.
People aren't proposing this just to cause chaos.
I mean, think about it. Supporters of this idea argue that it could actually be good for American manufacturing.
Really?
Yeah, they say it could bring jobs back to the U.S.
Interesting.
Their thinking is, when imported goods get more expensive.
Because of the tariffs.
Exactly. People will naturally start buying more stuff made in America.
Because it's cheaper. So like a Made in America comeback.
That's the idea.
Okay. I can see how that's appealing.
But even if that happens, it's not all sunshine and roses.
Oh, I figured there had to be a catch.
What if American companies can't keep up with demand?
Yeah, that's a problem.
What if the quality isn't as good?
Also an issue.
And some people argue that if domestic production goes up, wages will go up too.
Which is good for workers.
It is. But then prices for consumers would go up even more.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
In a way.
All right, so even the potential benefits come with their own set of problems.
It's complicated.
It seems like this whole proposal, it's a lot more than just a change to our wallets.
For sure.
It has these ripple effects that could impact everything.
Absolutely.
We're talking about global trade, consumer choices,
Yeah.
even potentially the relationships between countries.
It's all connected.
Well, this is a lot to process. We're going to need a minute to digest all of this before we keep going.
Yeah, there's definitely more to explore here.
All right, so we're really starting to see that this idea of swapping income tax for tariffs, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds at first. But let's get into some more of the nitty-gritty. You mentioned earlier that economists aren't so sure about whether tariffs could actually bring in enough money to replace income tax. What are some of the things they're worried about?
Well, one big concern is tariffs could actually discourage people from importing so much stuff.
Meaning they buy less stuff from other countries.
Exactly. So the government might end up collecting even less money, not more.
So it's kind of like shooting themselves in the foot.
You could say that.
I mean, I get the idea. Make imported stuff more expensive. People buy less of it.
Right.
But what if they take it too far?
That's the risk.
Like that vanilla extract example.
Exactly. If it gets way too expensive, the bakery might just say, forget it, we'll find a different recipe.
Or a different supplier, maybe.
Possibly.
So it's like a tightrope walk.
It really is.
Tariffs too low, you don't make enough money. Tariffs too high, you end up hurting your own economy.
And then there's the issue of tax evasion.
Oh yeah, people trying to cheat the system.
It's a possibility.
If people aren't paying income tax anymore, some of them might be tempted to find ways to avoid those import tariffs too.
Definitely something to consider.
Okay, so let's say for a moment that the government somehow figures out the money situation.
Yeah.
What about everyday life for people like you and me? How could this change things beyond just higher prices at the store?
Well, it could change how we shop.
Like what we choose to buy.
Exactly. If those imported avocados suddenly become a luxury item,
Which I'm already starting to think they are anyway.
people might start looking for more stuff made here in the U.S.
Which isn't a bad thing, right? Supporting local businesses and all that.
It has its benefits.
But wouldn't that mean less variety?
It's possible.
Like what if I need a specific ingredient for a recipe? Or a certain type of technology? And I just can't find it made in America.
That's a valid point.
Could stifle innovation too, right?
Potentially.
If the U.S. becomes more isolated economically because of all these trade tensions, we might miss out on new technologies and ideas from other countries.
It could definitely slow things down.
Like what if Europe is making huge advancements in renewable energy, but we can't afford their technology because of tariffs?
That would be a setback.
So it's not just about the economy. It's about culture and technology too.
It shows how interconnected we are with the rest of the world.
And that brings us back to those geopolitical consequences we talked about.
Right.
It's not just about a trade war. This whole shift towards protectionism, it could really damage our relationships with other countries.
Especially our allies.
Yeah. The U.S. has always been a big supporter of free trade and globalization. What happens if we suddenly turn our backs on that?
You could send a mixed message.
Like we're only looking out for ourselves.
Exactly.
And that can make other countries nervous.
They might start to wonder if they can rely on us anymore.
Or if we're becoming unstable.
It's a valid concern.
Wow. So we've gone from talking about avocados to talking about the global balance of power.
It's all connected.
This whole proposal, it started out sounding so simple, but now it seems like it could have these huge ripple effects.
It's definitely something that needs to be carefully considered.
Okay, so before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What are some of the assumptions behind this proposal? And are there maybe other ways to deal with the problems of income tax without potentially messing up the whole world economy?
Those are great questions. One of the assumptions seems to be that tariffs are a good way to make money for the government.
And we've seen how that's not necessarily true.
Right. Another assumption is that protectionism is good for the U.S. economy in the long run.
By protecting our own industries.
Exactly.
But history shows that's not always the case.
Yeah, protectionism can help certain industries in the short term.
Like a boost.
But in the long run, it often leads to higher prices for everyone, less choice, and slower economic growth.
So if tariffs aren't the answer, what are some other options? What else could we do about income tax without resorting to such extreme measures?
Well, there are a few things we could consider. One idea is to simplify the income tax system we already have.
How would we do that?
We could reduce the number of tax brackets.
So less confusion about how much people owe.
Exactly. And we could get rid of some of the loopholes.
That let people avoid paying taxes.
Right.
So make it fair for everyone.
That's the idea. Another approach is to shift the focus away from income tax
towards something else.
Yeah, like consumption tax.
So taxing what people buy instead of what they earn.
Exactly. We could implement a national sales tax.
Like adding a percentage to everything we buy.
Or a value-added
The
tax.
VAT.
Yep. Those types of taxes are usually considered more efficient.
Than income tax.
Uh-huh. And they can be designed so they don't unfairly burden people with lower incomes.
So it's not just the rich paying more.
Exactly.
It seems like there are other ways to address these concerns without completely overhauling the system.
It's definitely worth exploring those options.
But no matter what we do, we need to be careful and think about all the possible consequences.
Absolutely.
There's no such thing as a quick fix, especially when it comes to something as complex as taxes,
We need to have open discussions and analyze all the angles.
before making any big changes.
Agreed.
Well, this has been incredibly eye-opening. We've really dug deep into this idea of replacing income tax with tariffs. And it's clear that it's a really complicated issue with a lot of potential consequences. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about. Okay, so we've talked about all the potential ups and downs of this tariff idea, the economic risks, the global shakeups. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. How would you actually feel about this trade-off? No more income tax. Sounds amazing, right?
In theory, yeah.
But what if it means everything gets more expensive? Your groceries, your electronics, even your avocados.
That's a big question, isn't it?
Would you be willing to make that trade?
On paper, no income tax sounds fantastic. But then you think about your actual day-to-day life and how much more you might have to spend on everything.
Yeah, suddenly it doesn't sound so appealing.
And what if your favorite imported stuff just disappears from the shelves?
Or it's so expensive you can't afford it anymore.
Exactly. And then there's the whole global economy to worry about.
Right? What if things really spiral out of control?
It's a lot to consider.
And it's not just about the money either. It's
No.
about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where every country is just looking out for themselves, hoarding their own resources and industries, maybe even turning against each other?
It could definitely lead to more conflict.
Or is there a way to make things fairer without resorting to such extreme measures?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
And that's really what this whole deep dive has been about. We're not trying to tell you what to think. We just want to lay out all the facts and let you decide for yourself.
We need to understand the consequences of our choices.
Exactly.
Both the good and the bad.
So here's a little thought experiment for you. Next time you're at the grocery store, take a look around. See where all the products come from. Think about how their prices might change. In a world without income tax, but with really high tariffs. And then ask yourself, what trade-offs am I willing to make?
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a theoretical debate. It's about the real choices we face as individuals, as a country, and as global citizens.
That's what makes a good deep dive so interesting. It leaves you with more questions than answers. But hopefully you're a lot more informed and a lot more engaged.
Very
Thanks for
cool.
joining us. And until next time, keep diving.